Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing my wrap up for March. This is going to include every single book that I read in March this year, and there were 8 books that I completed in March. There were 8 books on my TBR for March, and there were 8 books I completed in March. You might think, boom, 100% ratio. No, I didn't read 2 of the ones on my TBR, and I read 2 new books that weren't on my TBR, but there we go. It was lots of fun. It was a really good reading month, and we're going to jump in starting from my lowest rated up to my highest rated. So let's jump in. So the lowest rated book I read this month was in fact the last book that I read this month. I did still enjoy it, just not quite as much as the rest of the books I read in March, and this is Streams of Silver by R.A. Salvatore. This is the second book in the Icewind Dale trilogy, so this is another trilogy following Drizzt the Dark Elf. I really loved the Dark Elf trilogy, which I read at the end of last year. I didn't love the Crystal Shard, which is the first book of the Icewind Dale trilogy, as much. I really didn't get on with that book. This for me was an improvement though. It's not going to be my favourite book of all time. It wasn't massively highly rated, but I did enjoy it. It definitely meant that I'm going to continue and I'm going to finish off this trilogy, and hopefully it does get better. So I gave this 3.5 stars. Now that's maybe slightly generous. It was maybe a 3-star read, which means for me it was okay. I liked it. It was fine. I had a good time. I didn't want to give up. It didn't make me angry. I didn't hate it for any particular reason. It was just okay. It was reading and it was fun. Now, that was largely because this felt insanely like a D&D book, because it's a D&D book. So that's not surprising, but it felt very much like going through the motions. There was a party that was set up. There were plot points that happened and were resolved. There was some bigger overarching story that was decent and I did enjoy, but it definitely didn't massively grip me. It was one of those that was good. I like reading these books. They're nice, quick reads. I like that I can pick them up cheap on Audible because they're often in the 2-for-1 offers, and I like them. They're fine. They're good. It's not as good as the Dark Elf trilogy was, in my opinion, which I much preferred. This Icewind Dale trilogy definitely seemed a little bit weaker, and I actually believe it was written before the Dark Elf trilogy, so that might make sense. But yeah, a 3.5-star read for Streams of Silver. Not bad at all, just not setting the world alight. The next lowest rated book that I read this month was actually a 4.5-star read. Now, when you have read 8 books in a month and your second lowest rating is 4.5 stars, that is a good month, let me tell you that. So this is a new release. This is a new release by John Scalzi called the Kaiju Preservation Society. I do have a review for this. There'll be a link down below. I really liked the Kaiju Preservation Society. For me, this very much felt like a pop song of a sci-fi book, and that is how John Scalzi describes it in his author notes. He says that he was trying to write a gritty, a dark, realistic, dense, heavy book, and it just wasn't happening during the pandemic, and instead he wrote this, and it is light, it is fun, it is really enjoyable. The basic premise of this is that we are following Jamie, who is a food delivery driver during the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City. They run into an old acquaintance on one of their deliveries, and they offer them the chance to apply for this job. And all Jamie is told, is that this organization works with large animals and it's an animal rights organization. That's all they're told. Now, as we follow on through this, we discover that this is the KPS, the Kaiju Preservation Society, and they work on an alternate world where there are no humans, and it is filled with huge, monstrous creatures that are roaming around. They're basically not even animals, they're more like ecosystems in and of themselves. Think Godzilla, think that kind of creature. It was super interesting. It was a really light-hearted take on sci-fi. I liked our main character. I liked the relationships that were built with them and around them. For me, it very much felt like the Chronicles of St. Mary's by Jodie Taylor, if anyone's read those. It felt like that kind of fun, enjoyable, alternate world sci-fi read that was just good fun. Really good read. It's not going to be a super thought-provoking book. It's not something that's going to be sticking with me in the long run, but it is something that I really enjoyed, and it was just good fun. So if that's something you want, something that's just good fun, this is the book for you. Kaiju Preservation Society, 4.5 stars. And now to round out the top end of this wrap up, there are 6 fantasy books, all of which I gave a solid 5 stars, which is just ridiculous. I am turning into Alan. I am a 5-star strumpet, apparently. So, the first one of these I want to talk about is by Evan Winter. It is called The Rage of Dragons, and this is a book I've heard people talk about over and over and over again, and I just never quite got to. This was originally self-published, and it is now traditionally published. It's an African-inspired fantasy story. It is the first book of a projected trilogy. Book 2 is already out, and we follow Tau. Now, Tau is part of the lower caste in his world. He's part of the Chosen. This is a race, a culture in this world. He's a common and he's a lower common. He's a lesser common. And for that, he really is right at the dregs of society. Tao's father is killed for something that occurs, and Tao spends the rest of this book on a real revenge arc. Now, I don't always love revenge arcs. Sometimes for me, they're a little bit one note. They can be a little bit monotonous. I actually really like this. I think Tao is characterized very well. I've seen a lot of people talk about how Tao is stupid, how he makes terrible decisions, but for me they're understandable terrible decisions, and that's very different to terrible decisions that are there purely to serve and advance the plot, which I don't love. Whereas here, these poor decisions felt like they were very realistic for Tao, our character. This book is very heavy military fantasy. Training and combat are what make up the vast majority of this book. So if you like that, great. If you don't love the training, the military, the combat side of fantasy books, this one might not be for you. But for me, for a really interesting and relatable character in Tao, for a very exciting and well executed revenge plot, and a world that is very interesting, and I've really not read much African-inspired fantasy, so for me that's a real bonus here that we're getting a very different world, a very different analog culture for this fantasy setting that I'm not used to. So I think Evan Winter's done a very good job here. I will be interested to pick up The Fires of Vengeance at some point soon. Next up, I'm going to talk about the last book of the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is The Last Argument of Kings. I really loved this. Now, the First Law trilogy for me has been a bit of a revelation this year. It was a series I really wanted to get to in 2022, so I read the first book in January, the second book in February, the third book in March. So I've ploughed through it. I have really, really enjoyed reading the First Law trilogy. I know for a lot of people, they say that The Last Argument of Kings isn't a very satisfying ending to this trilogy, and in some ways I agree. But I definitely get what Abercrombie's going for here. It isn't meant to be a heroic, epic climax where everything comes together and everything is happy and the princess ends up with the prince and life is good and everything in the world revolves around our main characters. That's not the point. That's not the point of what Abercrombie's trying to do here in the First Law, and that's totally fine. If you want to see more of my thoughts on the First Law generally, I've got spoiler-filled thought videos for all 3 of those books. What I will say is I really, really love Abercrombie's writing. I don't find the stories massively enjoyable in lots of ways because they're very dark, they're very gritty. Everyone is just such a nasty piece of work, really. Even the good guys, even the protagonists, the guys we're following and we're rooting for, they're just not very good. And again, that's what is being aimed for. That's not normally my style of fantasy. I don't normally love grimdark, but I do think the series was just done exceedingly, exceedingly well. And The Last Argument of Kings is no different for that. I love this last book. I think it's done very well. And I'm very interested to continue on with the First Law after I've given a little bit of a break from that grimdark setting. Next up, I want to talk about an arc that I had this month that I've read. This is The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is coming out in April. It's coming out on April 14th, I believe, although I think I've seen April 12th quoted somewhere as well, so maybe that's the UK-US differences. The Hunger of the Gods is book 2 of the Bloodsworn saga, so this is following on from The Shadow of the Gods that was released last year, and I really love this book. Again, there's a review for it down below. You can go click on that if you want to see more in-depth thoughts. But for those of you who don't know about the Bloodsworn saga, it is a Norse-inspired, Viking-inspired fantasy series in which in the first book we follow 3 main characters. So Varg, who is an escaped thrall, Orca, who is a dedicated mother, and we also follow Elvar, who is a young warrior trying to earn recognition and battle fame. And in this world, in Vigrid, the battle plane, there are bodies and skeletons of the old gods scattered around the place. These are huge animal-like skeletons that have lasted for hundreds of years, and in which often humans have actually built cities in or around them. It's very interesting, a very different setting in terms of the aesthetics, but I really loved it. For me, The Hunger of the Gods is pretty much everything I loved about The Shadow of the Gods, but just evolved and just continuing. Now, my one small gripe was that there were 2 extra point of views added in here for The Hunger of the Gods, and that made the start a little bit slow. These were characters who were kind of antagonists. These are characters who we weren't really meant to love in the first book, and therefore it was a little bit slow, and often when I had these characters' viewpoint chapters, I really wished I was with one of the 3 from The Shadow of the Gods, because I just love those 3 characters so much. However, that slight slowing down of the start, that slow build, I think was totally worth it, and John Gwynne uses that for amazing payoff as we get towards the end of this book. I was pretty slow reading the first 50% of this book. I was taking my time, and then I powered through the last 50% super fast, because everything was happening, everything was evolving, and I just really loved the way it went. This feels very much like heroic fantasy of yesteryear. Think David Gemmell, if you've read any David Gemmell, it very much feels like that. And it's something that I've absolutely adored. I think this will possibly become my favourite John Gwynne series. We'll have to see how book 3 goes, but I absolutely adore what he's been doing with the Bloodstone saga so far. And now I'm going to say finally, and you're going to think, finally, there's still 3 books to talk about here. Well, these 3 are all Jim Butcher titles. So the first of these is Captain's Fury. That's book 4 of the Codex Alera series. This I read 70% of in February, and I just finished off at the beginning of March. I think that book 4, Captain's Fury, is possibly the best book in the Codex Alera series. I love the way that it came to a climax at the end. I love that things from this book and the previous 3 books were all getting amalgamated together towards the end, how threads were overlapping and becoming revealed to our characters, and I just really love it. For those of you who don't know, Codex Alera is a Roman-inspired fantasy series. There's 6 books in it, and it has an elemental magic system. Jim Butcher was basing it off of Pokemon. So he's taking the Lost Roman Legion trope and Pokemon, smashing them together, and we get Codex Alera, and we get a 6-book series that is absolutely brilliant. Captain's Fury, I think, was the best of the series up to that point, and I gave a solid 5 stars. I then, this month, read Princeps Fury, which is book 5, and I think it is on a level with Captain's Fury. I like the way that things are continuing to evolve. I'm really excited for how it's set up book 6. I think that is a real strength of Princeps Fury, is that it sets up book 6 incredibly well, and that's something that I'm really excited to jump into in April. But yeah, I think that the characters we know and love are continuing to grow. We are continuing to see different sides of them. Some of them are changing allegiances, which is always super interesting to me. And overall, I just really like the way this is setting up book 6. It was a good story in and of itself, but so much of this series now feels like it's setting up book 6. And I think book 5 is a little bit weaker individually because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for book 6, I imagine. But I will totally say still a 5-star read. Every single book in the Codex Alera series has been a 5-star read for me. So that tells you something about Jim Butcher's writing, considering that I recently said my favourite series of all time was the Dresden Files, which is another Jim Butcher series. So shoot me. So talking of the Dresden Files, the last book I want to talk about that I read in March was book 10 of the Dresden Files, that's Small Favour. This was an interesting one for me because I haven't, a bit like book 9, White Knight, which I talked about in my last wrap up, I've never really massively rated Small Favour. In my head, Small Favour, like some big things happen and I kind of forget about the rest of it. And I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed Small Favour. This reread of the Dresden Files has made me fall in love all over again. So I really love Small Favour. I'm not going to tell you much about it because I don't want to spoil anything for previous books, but this is another brilliant instalment in the Dresden Files, and we're moving on to book 11 in April, which is Turncoat, and I know I love Turncoat. Turncoat is one of my favourite Dresden Files books, and I think is massively underrated and undervalued by much of the Dresden Files community, so I'm super excited for that. But Small Favour, a really nice surprise, more enjoyable, better than I thought it was going to be for this reread. So I'm super happy for that. So in summary, 8 books, 7 fantasy books, 6 5-star books. That is a ridiculously good reading month. There are going to be links for any of the reviews of those books that I've done previously down below, so go check them out if you want to know more information on them. Let me know down below what your best read of March was. So what was the best, your favourite read from March 2022? And if you want to see more of my content, there should be another video to go and watch over here somewhere. Cool. Right, I'll see you guys again later. Bye.